Welcome to the College Knowledge Podcast, sponsored by the College Planning Network and Paradigm Financial Group. Whether you're searching for that right fit college, applying to college, or figuring out how you're going to afford it all, you're in the right place. You'll hear from deans, admissions counselors, student athletes, and scholars from esteemed universities and colleges around the country. We'll dig deep to uncover their insight and unique experiences. So whether you're a student gearing up for college or a parent with college-bound kids, sit back, relax, and listen. Like you, we have lots of questions. Our guests have the answers, and we're excited to share them with you. Let's get started. We want to help. Send your questions to info@collegeknowledge.net. These can be about college, finances, careers, and anything else you have questions on. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to College Knowledge. I'm your host, Dave Kozak, alongside my co-host, Mr. Joe Kerins. Today, we are interviewing Professor Robert LaFleur, the professor of anthropology and history and the George Russell Corliss Chair at Beloit College. First of all, Professor, welcome to the show. We're very excited to talk to you.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here.
And before we were getting into the live section, you were explaining the uniqueness of the anthropology and history kind of dual piece. Can you give us a little background on anthropology, history, and how you bring them together, and what the endowed chair is that you represent or sit on?
Sure. I'll just go a little into my own background in saying that I was born an anthropologist. My dad was doing his graduate work at University of Wisconsin when I was growing up. And I took to anthropology right away, all the way to the point where I was doing field work. I would carry these little notebooks around with me, doing what we call field work, which is the kind of research, taking notes process. And I kind of mimicked my father in all of that. And even to the point where once my dad tried to explain when I was 7 years old the way that we gave gifts at Christmas through Marcel Mauss's theory of gift exchange. So I thought all these famous anthropologists were like aunts and uncles of mine. And so I grew up with anthropology, which is probably a little bit unusual. Yeah. But I came to history more circuitously when I started to realize, even when I was quite young, a long time ago, that things change. Yeah. And the funny thing is you can study a society in 1935 or 1985 or 2023, and that society will change. And so I started to realize that unless I understood the process of change, that the stuff I was fascinated with in anthropology would never make real sense. So flash forward, I combined these fields, and I can talk a little bit about that later in terms of talking about how colleges work and how it worked for me. But in flash forward to the present, I have a joint appointment in history and anthropology, which is a little bit unusual. There are some programs now increasingly in the country that combine the two. I have a lot of students that combine the two. The interesting thing from my perspective is that history and anthropology, and sometimes my colleagues can take this the wrong way when I explain this, but I don't mean this in any bad way. I mean it in a positive way for these two fields. They're the two total disciplines. Yeah. In other words, anthropology studies everything that human beings have anything to do with, all the way to bone structure, but how they eat, how they talk, how they do things. Well, so does history. Yeah. They're global disciplines. They study everything rather than taking slices. And by the way, important slices, but of life, economic life, social life, music, and the like, literature. And so anthropology and history cast a very wide net. And I found that it exceedingly appealing in both developing my own research interests and as a teacher.
Yeah, and I think it's a great combination of subject matter, because you can study a society or a culture and you can make observations, but the history teaches you how it got there, right? So when you combine those two together, now you understand not only how the society exists today, but how it got to exist in that particular fashion or form, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And funny story is when I started teaching at a different school, there was a person in the bookstore who said, "Well, we don't worry too much about your books because they never change their history." This is a complete misunderstanding, actually. What I like to tell my students is that history is a way of thinking, rather than a series of events to memorize. And I start with the quotation in all my classes, anthro or history. I start in all my classes with a quotation from the very great British philosopher and historian R.G. Collingwood.
Okay.
And in his autobiography, he actually says it much more directly and with much more venom than I'm going to say it. But my shortened version, where I start my classes, is if you can memorize it, it's not history. And of course, what my students immediately think is that's pretty much okay. And the interesting angle on this is that if we look at history as a way of thinking, as history as a process of history as a way of thinking through problems, all of a sudden everything starts to change. And I'll just add one other quick thing to this: that by the time they get to the end of the class, they get it.
Yeah.
I regret that not enough people out there really get it. That whole idea that history is always in process, and it's something that seems done. Like my funny example that I used to give for 20 years was in 2000, in the summer of 2000, the 1876 election was almost done, almost in that just memorize it category. Then all of a sudden, an election swung on the Electoral College, and all of a sudden we started rethinking all the elections where it was either close or the Electoral College dominated. And now we know for the last 20 years, this is a live issue.
Yeah.
But it was pretty sleepy up till 2000. That's the idea that history is always in process.
Yeah. I think always when we have conversations about history and different cultures, I think, a valuable lesson that I've learned just in sales or in anything that we constantly talk about is learning from mistakes.
Yeah.
And if you look back, that is the benefit of truly understanding where this was tried before. Here's the mistakes that were made. So is this something we need to avoid, or what do we have to do differently? So we don't have the old adage, history repeats itself, right? We constantly hear that, but it's I think understanding when you combine those two as well, that certain outcomes, when you add a certain culture to a process and it was done a certain way and it didn't work, to now adding it to a completely different culture you may have different outcomes. And I think that's a very interesting take on the combination, how I would be thinking about it.
No, absolutely, and I'm actually. It's funny you mentioned this because I'm actually working on an extended essay on the nature of history and decision making. This dates back to a program I'm associated with in Bavaria. I'll be going there again this summer to teach their master's thesis writing seminar, and it's around decision making. But again, history plays, as you said, a significant role in thinking through mistakes, successes, and it's often been repeated, but I can't help but tell the Mark Twain saying that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Okay.
So there's as you said, there's these echoes that we can kind of latch onto. It's never going to be the same, like in a laboratory experiment. And yet there is much we can learn. And again, as you said, and probably I've spent more of my life learning from my own and others' mistakes than from successes.
Yeah.
Which I think is a cool distinction and a very cool thought process you have to go through in what you're speaking about, where the reflection is as important as the decision itself. And so, and oftentimes we're in such a fast-paced society and economy now where we're just eyes forward, and we don't take that minute to reflect back so that, hey, you know what? I got 90% of that.
Mm-hmm.
But if I have that opportunity again, or I'm in any type of scenario that I could extrapolate what I did there to this one, I'm going to do it a little bit differently and tweak it. And so we don't take that time to reflect back, which I think is really cool about what you're teaching. And so I want to take it a different direction for a second, because I think this is vitally important to our listening audience. One of the things that we hear a lot, and I fight every day, because I went to a small liberal arts college like Beloit in Pennsylvania called Franklin and Marshall.
Oh yeah, of course.
And I had all the anthropology. I had what they call the core class, not even core classes. We call them foundational classes, where the goal of the class was simply to teach you how to think differently. What you think you know, do it a different way. And so I have all these people go, oh, my kid's not going to go to a liberal arts school. And I'm like, I don't think you really get it, because they're associating liberal, the word, with the political environment or whatever it is. And it's not that at all. Right. So can you give a little bit on the liberal arts college and philosophy? And then I think it ties directly into what you profess as a professional. That's a double entendre. but go ahead, please.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And that is one of the, given our political climate, this is one of the fortunate, kind of wordings. But liberal arts colleges have nothing to do with, liberal or conservative political philosophy.
Correct.
We can teach them. We both of them, and we often do in political theory classes. But what it comes down to is a liberal arts college. I have said my whole life that and I've learned this even more deeply as the years have gone on, and as I've spent time in East Asia, significant time in Europe, all over North America, and other parts of the world too, is a liberal arts education is hands down the best in the world for your 4 years of undergraduate education. And again, there's still a lot of misunderstanding out there about how liberal arts colleges work, what they're about, whether people get jobs, all of these kinds of things. And there's a lot of misinformation out there. I'm not saying that misinformation is directly meant to cause harm, but it's kind of generalized information that what you need to do is go directly from what you study to a job, and then everything is done. And so I like to tell the story. There's a president of a school. Well, this first school I taught at, out in the East. I'll leave it vague. But and I was there for 4 years, and every graduation weekend, there was baccalaureate on Saturday and there was graduation on Sunday. And he started his talk at the baccalaureate, where everyone went into the little chapel, all the grandmas and parents and everyone else. And he started by saying, a college education at a liberal arts college like ours is not very good training for. And then he had this way of doing it where what you heard was for your job and for life. What he said is for your very first job. And it was meant to shock. It was meant, as I like to say in teaching East Asian studies, like a Zen koan, that is meant to kind of shock you into thinking about larger issues. And he said, but it is splendid and the best training for your second and subsequent jobs. Mm-hmm. Now, I would go further and say, no, it's pretty good training for that first job too. Okay. He was trying to surprise. But the thing is, and I like to tell my students, again, a kind of little story that I just made up, but I said that your education here at your liberal arts college, where we are really working on writing, languages, really pressing writing. My students write back to me years later and they say, oh my gosh, the history department, the anthropology department, you made us write. And I'm so grateful, because everything you said about it being necessary out in the world, we didn't really believe you then, but that's what liberal arts colleges do. And they do it, I would argue, better than almost anyone else. So I tell this little quick story of you have your liberal arts education from a school like Beloit, and you're up against this person for the job at the widget company who majored in widget design. Okay. Because they're hiring widely, they hired both of you. Mm-hmm. For that first year, this is where that president's words have some truth. For that first year, you're struggling, but you have all the skills to be learning all the things about widget design that you learned from learning to learn in your Shakespeare class, in your social theory class. And so you're playing catch up with widgets that first year. But somewhere in the second year, I tell them, your boss is going to come to you and say, write a 5-year plan for in the coming years. That's where you're going to shine. And from then on, you will continue to shine. And to me, that's the heart of liberal arts education, is this ability to really put things together and be working with professors who are also researchers in a way that almost never happens in larger settings outside of the sciences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm going to back a story up real quick, because I did the full liberal arts college. I was a business major at a liberal arts school, right? Yeah. But my first year, freshman year, you have to take what's called a writing intensive course. And writing intensive means you are going to write. So me, being a smart guy coming from a private school education, I said, you know what? I'm going to take Econ 101 and I'm going to take it as, and I was like, it's the writing intensive. And everybody goes, you don't want to take that, professor. And I said, why don't I want to take that, professor? Like, this is going to be great. It's 3 days a week. It's a 50-minute class. I'm a piece of cake. I'm going to write about economics. It's fact. Well, first of all, it was the best class that I ever took. I learned more in that class than any other class. He was the hardest professor I ever took. He called me out several times in class, but I had to write every single day on economics. And people ask me to this day, like, how did you become such a good writer? I said, I got beat up and I got beat up and I got beat up. And second only to the anthropology professor that I took, that gave me a D on my first paper. And on the note, she said, I would have failed you, but I'm assuming this is the first writing you've done for college. That's the note I got. And so, at the end result, there's two things that I refined in college at Franklin Marshall Liberal Arts. Number one was my ability to write. Number two was my ability to speak. Because I had to stand in front of classes and I had to present and I had to play point and counterpoint to every argument. I had philosophy conversations that you don't get that type of environment. And I think, what people fail to realize in the liberal arts world is it is not designed to brainwash you or to give you some liberal ideology or conservative. It is designed to force you to think so that when you graduate, you can learn. And I think your example of the widget company is right. You've got all the raw tools, all the soft and hard skills. All you got to do is catch up on that one thing. And then you are going to surpass everybody else in that, because they don't have that ability to communicate. They don't have the written and verbal ability to communicate, the ability to manage multiple things, to think outside the box, to think in these different ways that you're trained to do in that. So I am a big proponent of a liberal arts education. So thank you for knocking that one out of the park.
Yeah, no, and it really is something like where you mentioned the public speaking as well. You cannot hide in a liberal arts college, and as you said, again, it's worth underlining. I often forget this, and I think those of us who are in the middle of it forget this kind of wider idea, use of the word liberal in political context, because it has nothing to do with what we do. But what has everything to do with it is just what you said about not just verbal communication. So I, over the years, have developed. It started as a half a page in 1997. It has now grown. It's my writing guide to 104 pages, where I walk students through the process. I'm getting ready to publish it, actually. But the idea is that I work through the things that would be expected in any publishing house. In other words, I say, why not just follow the ways of the big leagues and learn it right away? And so if you're not, putting your paragraphs correctly or any of these kinds of things, let's just solve that all right now. And so I have it all listed, and it works pretty well. But it's not just that; it's speaking. Yeah. And so my seniors just presented their work just yesterday as they get ready to graduate, where they've written these long review essays, and they think about things like who's the audience, who's reading it, and the like, which doesn't. I did go to a large university and did get a lot out of it. Don't get me wrong. For a year before I transferred to Carleton, a private liberal arts college in Minnesota, and but what I can say is you can't hide. You have to speak publicly, and you learn to. And those two skills, writing and speaking, there's very few things are more important in the larger world.
Agreed. I remember the old Elements of Style, Strunk and White. I was the one I had, So speaking to that, let's kind of get back to students and parents that are listening to this, right?
Yeah.
What type of student comes into a kind of combined anthropology history? What would the likes that you've seen, as they come in freshmen, right? They're young, their minds aren't fully developed, but they have these things they enjoy. What type of student kind of matriculates into your environment?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about anthropology, because it's Beloit is the rarest of places when it comes to anthropology. I often say when sitting in department meetings, and we have a 2-hour one this afternoon, actually. But in sitting in department meetings when we're either doing a job search or dealing with budgetary issues or bringing in new faculty, we have a couple of new faculty members this year. I always say that just pinch yourself, because no anthropology department in the country has a small sea of students who come to the college as pre-anthro. It just doesn't happen anywhere else. No. Beloit is highly distinctive there. Over the last 100 years, I think the last statistic I read, and I don't have it right in front of me, but I'm just going from memory here, is other than University of Chicago and Carleton, maybe Reed out in Oregon, Beloit College has more PhDs in anthropology over the last 100 years, kind of per graduate, than any school in the country. And so it's an odd situation where at the vast majority of schools, and all my friends in Europe, they're just waiting for students and trying to convince them from that first class. Somehow we've got this thing going. A quick story there is my father was doing his PhD up in Madison at the University of Wisconsin. When I was 7 years old, he took us on a pilgrimage to the Beloit College Logan Museum of Anthropology. And so I kind of had Beloit in my system from an early time. And so Beloit does that extremely well and has had a really quite storied reputation in that field. And yet students often still get there and they wonder what anthropology is. Often it's associated with archaeology. Well, that's true. It's one of the 4 subfields of anthropology. Increasingly in the last 20 years or so, television and other things have brought out the forensic anthropology side of things. Yeah. Again, quite fascinating. But then a lot of anthropologists do what I do, which is Language work, language and culture. Linguistics is a part of anthropology as well. That's the third subfield in the larger subfield called social and cultural anthropology.
Okay.
And so, for example, I in both teaching, where we teach ethnographic methods and how to do field work, we call it. How in other words, I like to think of it as how we teach them to see how things work. Mm-hmm. And if we're doing it right, and this is really an important point to me, if we're doing it right, we're doing our own research and we're bringing that into the classroom. Mm-hmm. Often that has this taint that parents and students hear this and they think, oh, we don't want someone doing research. We want someone teaching. That is a false distinction, I would argue. And the best liberal arts colleges, and I would argue Beloit is right there with them, the best liberal arts colleges understand this. Yeah. And again, I realize I'm going on, but when I first started, was just finishing graduate school at the University of Chicago. I was driving around Chicago and I heard this advertisement for a tiny little college in suburban Chicago. I won't name the name, but I heard it on the radio and it said, at our college, professors aren't doing, and then it comes out with almost a venom, aren't doing research. At our school, they're sitting in their offices just waiting to talk to you. And all I could think of, and I hadn't even started full-time teaching then, and all I could think of is, oh my God, just run the other way. You don't want someone with 30-year yellowed graduate school notes just waiting to talk to you. You want someone who will show you what he, she, they are thinking about, how they process problems, how they think through them. And that's what I do. Just to wrap this up, that's what I do. I spend my fieldwork time studying. I don't go to villages in China and study villages like a lot of anthropologists do. I go, my field site is the Sacred Mountains.
Okay.
And so I'm writing one book per mountain about the 5 sacred mountains of China. And there I go to the mountain, I talk to people, I talk to the monks, I talk to the people selling things, I talk to the tourists. These are like Appalachian size, 7,000 step mountains that have long 3,000 year histories. And so there's plenty to be done. But then I bring that back and then I teach students how to do field work, often from my own mistakes. And so the connection to the research we're doing, it often gets lost. Admissions departments are often afraid to talk about it because they're afraid that they'll lose the connection because they want to stress the teaching. The greatest teaching, and I think we have it, and I know Franklin and Marshall does. I have some colleagues there, and I know Carleton does, and I know many other liberal arts colleges have that connection. That's the special connection.
Mm-hmm. Thanks everyone for being a part of College Knowledge, powered by Elite Collegiate Planning. Just as an FYI, we are guaranteeing that you will save money on college by working with ECP. This is a guarantee that you will pay less. Book a free consultation at elitecollegiateplanning.com. Yeah, I mean, when I was at F&M, I had at least, if not every single professor had written a book, a textbook or something, and we would sit in the class and there's their book, and it would start the whole conversation. And I think there's a cool thing to add to that is we talk a lot, Joe, about growth and the growth mindset and the idea that we have to push forward, we have to learn, we have to continue to expand. And so the moment you take research out of that, you've lost it. Yeah. Right. Yeah. We're teaching yesterday's news for tomorrow's future, and it doesn't work. Now, it doesn't mean we don't look at yesterday and we don't look at that history and we try and pull the useful information out of that to apply it to today. But the idea that you're not pushing forward in your field or field of study, or you're not doing the active research. I mean, think about it. I think about it this way. When 50 years ago, there was a certain amount of majors. Yeah. Had those people not done the research, we wouldn't have all the new majors. We wouldn't have all the new stuff that has been created, right? I mean, even look at the scientific side. Engineering, you used to have the big five, right? You had your civil, you had your environmental, you had your mechanical, your nuclear came on late, and then your electrical, right? And you had your big five. Well, now there's biomechanical, there's the acoustic engineering. Engineering has just fractured because it all requires specific studies, right? So I think that's a huge distinction to make, and do not run from research. Research is what expands the ability to think, process, and move forward, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, and the best liberal arts colleges, and we're very proud of this at Beloit College ourselves, because we do an excellent job with this, I would say, is combining our research with student research. So let me give you a couple examples. We have the a wonderful program called the McNair program, and that's at several schools as well, but where students who come from backgrounds where maybe they have not had all the high school advantages and other things that maybe a few other students have, can link into this program and kind of supercharge themselves for graduate study. So they go and do research, present, do all kinds of things. We have another really special program, though, a summer research program where about a dozen professors every summer submit plans for their own research, and then they take on a student to work with them, who is usually a junior, who will be a senior the next year. And so I've done this a couple of times. I have 4 or 5 times, actually, all with things I was working on at different times. And so the most recent one is I'm translating Confucius's Analects. And you would think, oh, that's just what a literary person would do. Well, I don't see it that way. I think anthropologists should be translators, because what we study is the way people use words. And when I read Confucius, Chinese studies is my area. But when I read Confucius, and then I read the translations, I'm thrown off, because it's the translations sound very individualistic, very I-centered, character-centered, very Western. But then when I'm reading the text, and I know from my own fieldwork experience on the mountains and beyond, living in China, is I know that's not what the text is saying. And so when I work through, I was working through in the summer with this student as I did my draft translation that I'm going to finish this summer, is this student then, and then this particular student was from China, but would then go to the dictionaries and bring back to me some of the things that I could look through, and then we talk about it. And so the student gained, I gained, and that kind of sharing our research is something we also take seriously at liberal arts colleges. In other words, it's not just the professor. I used to be more polite about this, but when I hear my research university colleagues say, oh God, I can't stand teaching, just such a pain, it takes away from my work, I just look at them and I say, you're doing it wrong.
Yep.
If you're not getting something out of your teaching for your own work, and by the way, I mean, the students should be getting a lot out of your teaching too. Okay. Yep. But if you're not getting something back from it, you're doing it wrong.
Well, I think it's awesome you say that about the Confucius and the translation, all that, because if you look at the religious kind of diversions based on the translation of the Bible and how people how people like see it, right? You go from one sect of one religion, all in Christianity. If you stay on that side, they all think it a different thing. They all say it a different way. And so like, if you don't realize that, and that, you go back to the election of, I think you said 1876 or 1896, right? If you go back to that, right? What happened over that 100 years is, okay, it kind of got, this is how it works. This is how it works. Okay. Dead story. All of a sudden it's reinvigorated, right? Same thing is happening in all of this translation. It's almost the investigation of how the words got to be what they are today that matter, and how we translate and how we interact with them from a mental standpoint. So again, I can't reiterate enough the amount of thinking that has to take place. And God, if we could just teach more people to think. I hate to say it that way, but like COVID, I mean, it's got to be a study in the future that is just going to be fascinating. But we have seen a lot of people just kind of give up and say, oh, whatever I got to do, whatever you tell me, I'm just going to do, and stop the thought process on it. And I think it's indicative of that. Well, this is how it is, and you just do it. Well, why? Right? What's that question? That magic question? Why?
Yeah.
So.
No, and you are right to point out, and this is quite well known, but we're seeing it all through higher education and all other levels too. COVID really did a job.
It sure did.
And I think you are right to point out that it even did in the sense of almost setting us back in terms of what knowledge is all about. In other words, it's not just about the right answer.
Yeah.
The so-called right answer. It's about thought process. It's about thinking. And that again, it's the role of all education, but I think that at the higher education level, liberal arts colleges do it. I used to say as well as anyone. No, they do it. We do it better than anyone. And again, I don't mean that in a mean way. I've had, and I'm not saying that people don't get excellent educations at other places. It's not that, but it is that it's something truly special. So this professor of mine at Carleton, just an esteemed, a wonderful anthropologist, and his father was a very well-known sociologist who wrote a book called The Lonely Crowd. But in any case, this professor of mine, when I told him I was going off to graduate school, and I would like to be a professor, maybe at a liberal arts college, he said, liberal arts colleges are the very best place to be a student. And they're a pretty good place to be a professor.
Yeah.
And I think that's right. In other words, to do what I've tried to do in my career, which is really have everything, to be an effective teacher, but also an effective researcher with even some productivity, not just a few things here and there. That's really hard. And it requires kind of keeping the focus because, and some people would think, oh, that means taking away from teaching. No, it means teaching and research are the driving things, and everything fits like pebbles around that. And it's hard to keep that focus because at a research university, I've recently heard stories about that. A funny one was where a new professor came into the tenure committee, was just elected to it. And it was a research university, and said, well, maybe the breakdown we should be looking for professors is 70, 20, 10. So 70% research, 20% teaching, 10%. No liberal arts college would accept that breakdown, by the way. Okay. You have to be an excellent teacher. Okay. Yep. But nonetheless, this is a research university, and he said 70, 20, 10. So, in other words, a significant place for teaching. An old math professor, as he told me this story just a while ago, that said 99-1-0. In other words, we don't care. We don't care about your teaching. Now, I've been at a lot of research universities where there's really good teaching. Mm-hmm. The difference is, though, it's not rewarded directly.
Yeah.
In other words, you teach well because it's just what you do.
Yeah.
But at a liberal arts college, we do spend a lot of time focusing on how the classroom works and class participation, discussion, and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And in my experience, I would say that every tenured professor, and I will reiterate this, after I took the hardest professor in economics, it was known, his name is Dr. William Weitzel. He was the best, but also the worst. From that moment forward, I tried to take classes that only were taught by tenured professors. And specifically to your point, they are excellent. I won't say all of them. I can't just lay that out there, but like they are excellent teachers, professors, they make you think. It was painful. I spent days and nights and weekends in the Shattuck Fackenthal Library at Franklin and Marshall just trying to get my work done. But I learned, I learned about macro and microeconomics, and I learned about economic game theory, and I learned about anthropology, and I learned about why we speak, and I learned all these things, right? But I learned how to think about and be situationally aware, and to be thinking about the next step and the last step simultaneously, to make sure that that next step didn't fail or was equally as successful as the last step. So again, I'm a proponent. One thing that I also want to make mention, and I don't know about Beloit, so I'll ask you this question, but we had science majors, we had biology, pre-med, we had business, we had economics. It wasn't just liberal arts college. You don't just come out with a liberal arts degree. Like, we had BSs and BAs, and we had all of it. But I think it's the foundational component of the structure that is designed to teach you how to think, as opposed to just give you the information, right? So is Beloit the same way?
Absolutely, and I cannot stress that enough. So let me just give you a quick example of my this last semester, where I'm teaching a course that's cross-listed with anthropology, history, and environmental studies, and I just call it Mountains. And in that class, we do significant geology, as well, and then what I like to jokingly call just long-term history, long-form history, and of course historical study, then the culture of the mountains, the environment of the mountains. In other words, we're bringing it all together in a truly interdisciplinary fashion. Mm-hmm. That's the other thing that should be mentioned about liberal arts colleges. It kind of ties on to your point, which is often those disciplines, while we can learn them, major in them on their own, they find their way into other disciplines. Mm-hmm. And I would say, again, that liberal arts colleges are particularly good, and Beloit in particular, I think, is exceptionally good at this, but of bringing them together in a way that brings the thinking process even further along than if you're taking geology here and history here. And I hope people do that. Don't get me wrong. But to have some courses where you merge them together really clicks. I like I often just laugh inwardly, but also seriously tell students to rethink what they're doing when they say, "Oh, I'm feeling guilty because I'm seeing these parallels between this one paper I'm writing and this other paper I'm writing." And I tell them, that's exactly the point. Okay, this is what we're waiting for. This is what is supposed to happen. Yeah, in other words, it's not guilt that something is coming from political science and something else is coming from econ.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
It's funny too.
Exciting.
Yeah. I remember two courses. I know you're chomping.
Well, I just about have a question like
two courses I took. One was called "Why Do We Speak?" Right. Yeah. So, first of all, phenomenal question. And then the end result was because we have the physical and mental capability to do so. But it took 3 months to get to that conclusion through all. I mean, we went through the structure of the human body. We studied apes. We studied other animals and how they communicate. It was all communication driven. And then but it's a simple answer, but it goes through a incredible progression of thought to get to that simple answer. And the other one was navigation. And so when you want to expand your brain, try and figure navigation out. Sit down and so that goes back to the celestial piece, the stars. It goes to all of that. Then it comes to time. You have to figure out time to be able to navigate. Then you have to figure out triangulation. And so all these mathematical principles come to and at the end of the day, we now have a GPS system where you can turn your brain off and just drive, right? So, but we did orienteering, so we're out on mountains trying to figure out where we're supposed to be. It's crazy, and when you start bringing a simple question like why do we speak, and the science behind it, and then the cultural phenomenon behind it, and the development of language itself, the ability to articulate, but then not just because you can articulate now. Well, how can you make different sounds that make different things, that explain different things, that communicate it through societies? And then on the navigation one, you're going, man, you've got oceanography, you've got the topography, you've got the stars, you've got the mathematics behind time and the creation of time, following the sun, understand
longitude. Yeah.
Read a book.
My
called
God, longitude is so complicated. I mean, it's latitude simple.
Yep.
Longitude is hard.
Yeah, and think about the calculus and the math behind that, and the actual principles to get to that. Like it's incredibly powerful to pull all those different disciplines together and create these outcomes. So, and to me, that is teaching people how to think.
Yeah.
Bingo. Yes.
My question with the mountains course. So when your class is there, is it typically that, that class is all one declared major? Are there different majors, different students? Does it work towards different degrees? Would that course count towards different degrees? I was just curious how, like, a class that does merge.
It counts for different degrees, but they're from all different programs. I was just really delighted with the group that we put together, and one of the things we're hoping to do down the road to have a version of where I students on the Chinese mountain where I'm working. That's another thing that COVID didn't help that.
Yeah, but, not at all.
That's another thing. But for this particular class, which is an on-campus class, of course, I had a geology major, I had a couple chemistry majors, a couple history majors, anthro, a number of environmental studies majors. And the course counted for all those because that's partly because of my joint appointment, and I do also have an appointment in environmental studies, and so it could count toward those various things depending on how the registrar listed it. But in all cases, they had to put it all together. No matter what discipline they were coming from, they had to put it together themselves.
Got it.
Yeah, right. Each person chose a mountain, which was fun. I just came up with that right the day before the class started, that somehow that would be the final project and where they'd work on it the whole semester. It worked just splendidly. I can't believe how well it worked. Some people pick mountains where they right behind their homes in Wausau, Wisconsin, and barely mountains by that stretch. But and others just pick. I just said you may not pick Everest. That's the only one you may not pick.
So the study of different cultures, different societies, I think is so important. And I think a lot of what we see today, and there's something that I watched last night that I'm going to bring this full circle, but being in a bubble and believing that everyone thinks the way that you think and they believe the way that, and they like their lives are the same as yours. I think a lot of people feel that way, and expanding your knowledge to understand how different things are is so important. And so it was just funny because I was watching this comedy show we're outside of Philadelphia. Okay. And so this comedy show is about basically a suburb, or we'll say it's called Delco, but
that's Delaware County.
It's some people will say it's from Philly.
I spent a lot of time in Doylestown. So,
okay. So these guys are being interviewed on a radio show, and they get to talking about, there was a beef and beer. And then the radio show's in New York, and they go, "What's a beef and beer?" Right. I'm going, I know what a beef and beer is, no problem.
I've been to dozens of them.
Now this whole show takes off on all these different phrases that they had. You're not part of the family you married in. Right? Like, that's a very common, people in New York, like, what are you talking about? But the funniest one, because I literally had the same reaction. They said, it's always big parties, neighborhoods, very close, aunts and uncles are neighbors, get that. But when someone leaves, you have to let them know that you got home, right? Call me when you get home, text me when you get home. My entire life has been when I leave the house with a family member, I have to text everyone I was just with and let them know that I got home. The people in New York were saying, what are you talking about? That is not real. And the guy, he was like, wait, not everyone in the world does this. I'm just learning. And I'm listening to this going, wait, not everyone does this. And they get into, my grandmother, we call her mum. And they're like, what? Mum? I'm like, yeah, that's what like everybody calls their grandmother. Like, don't they? Like, no, but it was just that, like, it was funny to, talk about different cultures. And we're talking about an hour and a half drive.
Yes.
And how different a culture and society can be from that short of a distance. To study historical and societies and cultures all around the world can be so beneficial, not just to understand that you get out of your own world, but how to, as you were saying, like how to think in the future, how to interact with people that may not have the same experience, but also don't just think that everybody thinks the same way that you do, right? Understand people come from different backgrounds. To understand that aspect can help you in almost any career. Right. Yeah. Just to not be in that boat. And I think part of that is an issue right now, because I think so many people just have that mentality that, well, if you don't think the way I do, you're wrong.
You gotta credit COVID with a lot of that. It forced everybody into the bubble, right? I think there's an interesting concept in anthropology coming forward, which is the combination of politics and anthropology in the United States, not from a federal level, not even from a state level, but down to the local level, and how each local government chose to deal with the federal and state changes and regulations over the last 3 years, because they were coming hot and fast, and nobody was prepared for that type of decision making. And some places did it very well, some places did it very poorly. And like how, in my adult life, I never really paid attention to local politics.
Right.
Never really affected what we did. It was a, rubber stamp, whatever needed to be rubber stamped and move it along. Then all of a sudden COVID comes along, and now a lot of power is bestowed upon the local community. And were they prepared for that type of decision making? And so I think there's an interesting societal battle struggle to evaluate in that.
No, and I think anthropology and history, of course, but I think anthropology is particularly useful for all the reasons both of you have been discussing, of trying to understand even these micro differences. Now, as you explained them, they're not too micro when they're happening to you. When it's like, no, that is what we call grandmothers. Okay. North Dakota, okay, or something like that. And that was, that's one of my fun things is students, get to know me, and then they're like, oh yeah, you spent a lot of time in Japan, and okay, you spent a lot of time in China, or whatever. And then they hear I'm from North Dakota, and they're it's just like, whoa, you're from North Dakota? So that's the exoticism in my life. But what you're saying is ever so true in terms of these little changes. I used to kind of laugh when I was studying Japanese down in Indiana. I noticed and the kind of linguistic differences, just little things, but how everyone would finish sentences by saying yeah. What was it? That really worked well, or something. And they'd have all these little sentence ending particles that fascinated me, that we didn't have the same kind of talk up in North Dakota where we talk like this, and we use really, we say really. And you start to hear these little things, and those little kind of language changes they're not dialects, but not even close, but they also reflect all kinds of cultural differences that you're getting at. And the way we use words, and then the ways we interact. I mean, if you're going to a potluck in Minnesota, you better be bringing a casserole. Okay. And then other people in the country, what's a casserole? Okay. and so I would go even further. Well, I think it's just exceptionally important, and I've lived my life this way, to travel much farther, and see radically different ways of doing things, like in China and Japan, in my case. I am constantly astounded by the small changes in, as you're saying, an hour and a half here, an hour and a half there in our own country. And so this idea of some kind of American culture is just ludicrous. Yes, in a larger sense, we can speak of things like that, but there are so many variations that teach us, as you're saying, how to think. If we're good at trying to understand how those things work, it teaches us how to think.
You familiar with a hoagie?
Of course, yes. I travel a lot.
Yeah. I mean, you say hoagie in the wrong part of this country, and they're like, "Well, what are you talking about?"
You pick up your pizza the wrong way
right?
You fold your pizza in Minnesota, and people are wondering, "What's wrong with you?"
It's keeping the delicious on the inside. No,
it really is.
This is great stuff. And I also want to reflect back to one of the very first things you said, and you were talking about job placement and first job versus second job.
Yeah.
I would also like to reiterate, I did my research on Beloit before coming into this conversation. 96% of graduates of Beloit College are employed within 6 months of graduating.
Yeah.
That's a real statistic. So it's not because and I would argue two things. The only thing people hire are number one, the written word, and number two, how you speak to them. And the honesty and transparency. And so when you graduate at college and you have the ability to write and to speak, the job interview is yours, right?
No, it's absolutely true. And I see it constantly. And so I talk to, many students and parents who are nervous about these things, but those, as you said at the beginning, and as I've already throughout, is what we, and then, so I just want to say one other quick thing, which is one thing I've always done informally with students, and now I've actually made it into a little class for first years as well, just a small class, but I call it the life syllabus. And the thing is that what I feel strongly, and this is kind of my, what I just want to kind of finish with here is I feel very strongly that on some level, every single class, single aspect of education in our entire lives, from kindergarten through PhD, on some level, every single class and interaction should be about how shall we live our lives among others? Mm-hmm. And that means speaking, communicating. I think liberal arts colleges do this well, but I would say as kind of a reminder to educators in general and parents and teachers that that should be our aim. Getting the job will work out if you gain all these skills. So you have to work hard at them and all of those things you've been saying and I've been saying. But the thing is that when you get right down to it, how shall we live our lives? Too often I have to learn this thing. I have to learn that thing. And yet, as you said, the whole point is to speak, to communicate. Well, why do we do that? Maybe to get the job, but ultimately we do that in order to become better people. And I mean that in the broad sense. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And not just a good person who does good things. I hope people do that, but in the broader sense of someone who is truly contributing to the world around.
Yep, absolutely. And I think, for all the parents listening, that's the goal we have as parents, is to have those good people. They're good at things, as well as good to others, as well as good to themselves, as well as mentally good, right? It's the entirety. And, one of the other pieces that I'll add, and I know we're out of time here, but the idea that mental health has been a big struggle post-COVID. And this idea of learning to think is mental health strengthening, period. Right? Yeah. It is good for the psyche to be able to process, reason, justify, and all of the self-coping mechanisms are developed as you're taught to think, as opposed to memorize this, do this, do this, do this, and the job's done. Right? So again, this has been an incredible conversation. I hope everybody listening enjoyed I'm trying to figure out how to say it, but Professor LaFleur, I think, is the best thing, because I think you did a great job of professing to us in your expertise in your area at Beloit College. And thank you so much for being on the show. This was incredible.
No, I enjoyed it very much. Thank you both.
Yep. Thank you. Everyone, this has been College Knowledge. We'll catch you next week. Hey guys, don't forget, send anyone our way who needs help with college or who is sending a student to college. College planning the right way requires an expert. Book a free consultation at elitecollegiateplanning.com. Thanks for listening to the College Knowledge Podcast with your hosts, Dave Kozak and Joe Kerins. We hope you enjoyed this week's exploration of higher education, sponsored by the College Planning Network and Paradigm Financial Group. That's all for this episode. See you next time.